Hey, this is Dr. Mike Scaringa. If you've watched my previous videos, you know that I've said that toxic stress and complex PTSD are some of the most deceptive persuasion campaigns in the history of psychiatry. The goal of these movements is to transform social policies, and I've given some examples. In this video, I'll give you a closer look at how they've been doing that by going through 3 examples of so-called trauma-informed approaches. I think it's enlightening and stunning to see in detail what supporters of these movements are willing to say and do. In policymaking, scientists do have an important role. Their role is supposed to be to help guide policymakers by supplying the truth behind an argument. But supporters of toxic stress have gone far afield from that and weaponized neuroscience to supply misinformation. Toxic stress is not a scientific term. A pediatrician at Harvard University named Jack Shonkoff invented the term for marketing. He wanted to promote social policies that he was passionate about, but the problem is that toxic stress is not scientifically based. Shonkoff first experimented with the concept of toxic stress in a paper he wrote in 2000. At that time, he called it, quote, stressors that are toxic, unquote. In 2003, Shonkoff formed a private council at Harvard who all supported his agenda, and they agreed to create a persuasion campaign to convince people that stress was a public health crisis. In a report written by the center staff, they reviewed the history of the center. They said, with no apparent shame, that they agreed to market toxic stress to shout more loudly to promote their causes. The council tweaked the phrase into the stickier, quote, toxic stress, unquote, and embarked on an extensive marketing and persuasion campaign. They targeted lawmakers to convince them of this belief, and they were wildly successful. This narrative also found traction with researchers. This graph shows the steep rise in science papers that use the phrase toxic stress in titles or abstracts. In my book, I describe a sampling I did of the scientific literature and estimated that toxic stress, while not being true, is cited as fact in over 30,000 articles per year in the psychology literature. However, the overall evidence is pretty convincing that the toxic stress theory is not valid. So here's the first example of weaponizing toxic stress to drive societal transformations. On April 12, 2015, a 25-year-old African-American man died in police custody in Baltimore. Public protests followed immediately, partly because of similar incidents in other cities in the past year. The protests turned very violent. Police were injured, buildings burned, businesses and schools shut down. The governor declared a state of emergency and activated the National Guard. One of the main responses of the government was led, curiously, by the Baltimore City Health Department, which rapidly drummed up a, quote, mental health trauma recovery plan, unquote. Initially, the plan was to help patients get medications because more than a dozen pharmacies were burned down. The plan quickly evolved, however, into a, quote, trauma-informed series of interventions, unquote, which included a call for funding of treatment for trauma and for social programs such as housing assistance and for training in, quote, trauma-informed care for every frontline employee in the city, unquote. The Baltimore City Health Department was led at that time by Dr. Leanna Wen, which is noteworthy because after her stint in Baltimore, she has become very active in other social causes, as, for example, the president of Planned Parenthood, and now a medical consultant for CNN, who was extremely outspoken in favor of COVID lockdowns, vaccine passports, and doing anything possible to make the life painful for people who refuse to give up their personal freedoms. The plan was submitted to the Baltimore City Council in the form of a resolution. Dr. Wen included a memo in support of the resolution, which made it crystal clear that the root cause of all the civil unrest that they all should agree on was, of course, trauma. Quote, the majority of our residents have suffered from trauma, not only from the unrest, but from decades of poverty, neglect, racism, and rampant disparities, unquote. And with that, we see, again, as I've described in other videos, it's convenient for advocates to expand the meaning of trauma to include any disparity of one's favorite causes. Now, note also that Dr. Nguyen included poverty, neglect, racism, and disparities as types of trauma, even though these are not true life-threatening traumas. The City Council passed the resolution, which funded a committee to write a report. The 60-page report was full of recommendations of unproven programs to prevent violence by youth and reduce crime. The recommendations would shift the old, quote, cradle-to-prison pipeline, unquote, and transform it into a new, quote, cradle-to-career pipeline. How would the amazing plan achieve something that had never before been achieved in a major American city? The plan acknowledged that it would not be easy, but everything was focused on trauma because of the supposed, quote, decades of research, unquote, that has shown that experiencing and witnessing violence can rewire children's brains. In summary, advocates in Baltimore seized an opportunity of civil riots and used Shonkoff's hammer of toxic stress to implement the trauma-informed playbook. Was this done to address rioters' concerns, or was this just an opportunity that activists seized to implement an expansion of social programs they had long wanted to implement, or a little bit of both? An interesting question, but a moot point, since the foundation of toxic stress is not scientifically supported. Here's a second example. In 2018, a coalition of groups appeared to have worked out a different kind of strategy to weaponize toxic stress for social reform. The strategy started with what appeared to be investigative journalism. The local newspaper, the Times-Picayune, decided to write a series of articles about a football team of 9 and 10-year-old boys. I live in New Orleans and was interviewed for the series, and there are other interesting and curious details about that episode in my book. During 1 week in April 2018, the newspaper ran this series as front-page articles with heart-tugging photographs and very alarming statements. The aim of the series, called The Children of Central City, was, quote, an examination into an often overlooked public health crisis, chronic exposure to violence and its devastating effects on children, unquote. These effects being crime, drug use, early death, academic failure, joblessness, and other social ills. The first piece of information we were told, and the only piece of information we were ever told in this series about any risk factors that put these boys at risk for failure in life, was that toxic stress was the underlying cause of all of these problems. The journalists wrote, quote, the Children of Central City details how repeated exposure to violence alters a child's brain development and other systems in the body, unquote. The article also clearly laid out a second theme. The government was to blame for neglect of funding. If children like these boys were offered mental health treatment for their trauma experiences, they could be saved, but they were not offered mental health treatment because of government funding cuts, which was also not true. I was interviewed for this series, as I mentioned, and I gave them the evidence that this wasn't true. Toxic stress would be the drumbeat of the entire series. Even though the journalists provided no evidence these boys were damaged goods, the journalists portrayed these boys, and all boys in similar situations, as living in an utterly predictable downward path of crime, joblessness, and homelessness because their brains were being permanently damaged by trauma through toxic stress. Several months later, it suddenly became clear what was really going on. A resolution was introduced in the New Orleans City Council that specifically cited the Children of Central City series in the preamble. The resolution clearly laid out, in writing, the whole toxic stress playbook. According to the resolution, the youth of our city suffer unrelenting failures in mental health, physical health, behavior, and become violent criminals, and thanks to our investigative reporters, we now know it's all because of trauma, all of which I've noted earlier and in other videos are not supported at all by science. The resolution passed unanimously. It authorized the city's Children and Youth Planning Board to create a master plan and called for specific quote, strategies to supplement services that are unfunded or underfunded by Medicaid or other federal programs. Strategies to increase funding, including the reallocation of resources and or the creation of new revenue streams, unquote. Within months, this planning board published a massive 209-page report as the blueprint for creating new government programs and positions, such as funding a nearly endless stream of education and marketing programs, and even programs to landscape vacant properties and remediate abandoned buildings. In summary, advocates in New Orleans seized an opportunity and used Shonkoff's hammer of toxic stress to implement the trauma-informed playbook. A third example. On January 1, 2020, California launched a 40 million statewide screening program for ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences. It was the first of its kind in America. The funding for this had been passed in 2016 as Proposition 56 with a cigarette tax. California's Surgeon General, a pediatrician named Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, launched the ACEs Aware Project, which offers training to pediatric clinics on how to screen for toxic stress and pays doctors $29 each time they conduct a screening. Dr. Harris has been a huge supporter of toxic stress and ACEs, wrote a book on the topic, and gave a TED Talk espousing the incredible, life-altering impacts of toxic stress. The bold goal of this screening initiative was to reduce ACEs and toxic stress by half in one generation. How would they achieve that? By screening with relatively simple and short surveys about the 10 ACE items. As you can see, the survey includes only 3 items that are true traumas, numbers 7, 8, and 9, and the other 7 items are non-life-threatening stress, many of which are pretty common, such as having parents with mental health problems or divorce. This screen creates a score of low, intermediate, or high risk of a toxic stress physiology. Never mind that it doesn't actually measure any physiology. Then this score is supposed to trigger clinical actions, such as informing the patient that they have been damaged by toxic stress, teach them about good sleep hygiene and nutrition, and other extremely vague, unproven homilies. I don't have time in this video to explain how impractical most of those are. There is, however, no scientific evidence this screening program can work. As a screening program, it violates basic principles of screening programs in that none of the things being screened for are markers for the outcomes they're trying to prevent, which are the usual violence, brain alterations, joblessness, homelessness, and poverty. In summary, California had found yet another way to use the Shonkoff hammer of toxic stress to expand social programs. After seeing those 3 examples, let's review how the toxic stress playbook works. Step 1, identify the societal problems. Recite a massive list of problems in society that aren't being solved. These always involve either victims or portray disadvantaged groups as victims. The problems include poverty, poor academic performance, crime, drug abuse, murder, domestic violence, and multi-generational racism, among others. Step 2, blame it all on trauma. Cite statistics that children are exposed to high rates of trauma and violence, and they suffer from poverty, neglect, racism, and rampant disparities. Step 3, make it sound super scary by claiming toxic stress is supported by science. Claim that these exposures caused permanent damage to brains, also known as, quote, the largest public health crisis, unquote, of our time. Step 4, make the big ask for funding. The solutions require lots of funding for lots of social programs. All of these programs are called trauma-informed approaches, which typically include training everybody in trauma-informed principles and providing treatment, housing assistance, school-based care, home-based care, which will prevent crime, prevent joblessness, prevent drug abuse, and prevent homelessness. I only went through 3 examples in this video. There are many more. For For example, advocates tried to leverage toxic stress and testimony to Congress to influence federal immigration policy. Courts are trying to transform handling of juvenile criminals. School systems are trying to teach this playbook to children. It's clear toxic stress is going to be the hammer for almost every new social policy effort dealing with victims and disparities in the future. Governments are trying to push through universal child care in preschool. Maryland passed a new law last year to try to become the next California. It's been used to supercharge race controversies and COVID policies. Why are they doing that? Promoting something that's not true as scientific fact. I've explained it in detail in my book, The Trouble with Trauma, and in another video called Unreported Truths of Complex PTSD. It's an ideology primarily based on skewed morality. Psychology is in an ideology war. Some psychologists seem aware of the war, but I think most of them don't even know they're in an ideology war. What they're doing is intuitive, probably even unconscious, because they're engaged in mental efforts to make the external world appear seamless with their inner world. They're only dimly aware of why they're promoting false facts, which for mental health professionals is a bit unnerving. That's all for now. Comments are always welcome. If you like this video, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to my channel.